Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Amazing. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And again, to the team at the UCLA Film and Television Archive for hosting this program, particularly Paul Malcolm, the programmer, and to the UCLA Center for India and South Asia for their very generous support of this program. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Mayukh Sen. I am the author of the biography you see up there, Love Queenie, Merle Oberon, Hollywood's first South Asian star, came out from Norton earlier this year. It is for sale outside from our friends at Larry Edmunds. Please snag a copy. I really gotta eat, gotta make a living, right? So I appreciate it. But before we watch this film, Dark Waters, which is very much a deep cut from Merle's vast filmography, I want to just give you all a primer on who Merle Oberon was, what compelled me to write the first biography of her in over 40 years, and where this film sits in her overall body of work. So, first things first, who is Merle Oberon? Let's all just get on the same page here, especially, I don't want to presuppose anyone's prior knowledge of her, given the viscosity of misinformation that surrounds her name. So, Merle Oberon was an old Hollywood actress born in what is today Mumbai, India. She went by the pet name Queenie growing up there. Her mother was South Asian, from what is today Sri Lanka, and her father was white, from England, and she grew up in abject poverty. Despite these circumstances, she became the first performer of color and first Asian actress ever nominated for an Academy Award when she received a Best Actress Oscar nod for the 1935 film, The Dark Angel. But she's probably most famous for playing Kathy in a little movie you might have heard of called Wuthering Heights from 1939, in which she starred opposite Laurence Olivier's Heathcliff. You can see a beautiful photo of her from that film there. There's this iconic scene where she's chasing Heathcliff in the rain. But there is a wrinkle to her story, one that I'm sure many of you are aware of. Throughout Merle's 4-decade-long screen career, she concealed her South Asian heritage and Indian birthplace at the behest of her publicists and passed as white. This was due, initially at least, to the pressures of both Hollywood's Hays Code as well as the realities of American immigration and citizenship law. Well, I'll expand on those factors in a moment, just sit tight. From her earliest days as a contract player for the company London Films in 1932, all the way up until her death in 1979, she maintained this studio-constructed fiction that she'd been born in Tasmania, Australia, as the progeny of white European gentry. It was only after her death in 1979 that the truth of her origins, or most of the truth, and again, we'll get to that in a second, just sit tight, emerged. So some of you might be wondering, okay, why is this little boy writing a book on Merle Oberon, right? This actress who died many decades ago and is remembered and even loved by few. So let me tell you that story. I came to Merle Oberon's story pretty early in my own cinephilia. I remember it with crystalline clarity. It was the summer of 2009. I was on the cusp of my senior year of high school, and I was an Oscar obsessive, kind of a loser, that kind of thing, right? And so I made it my quest that summer to study the history of the Best Actress in a Leading Role category. Really fun stuff, right? Very busy summer, of course. And it was in that search that I came across the name Merle Oberon. And when I looked into her story, I was stunned. I had no idea that a South Asian woman had risen to the very top of Hollywood so many generations ago. Keep in mind, this is around the same time that Slumdog Millionaire had just run the table at the Oscars, and many of us were pinning our hopes on Frida Pinto to be the next big thing, right? Merle also grew up in the city where my Bengali dad was from, Kolkata or Calcutta. I then promptly sought out Wuthering Heights, and her performance floored me. My young mind could not quite comprehend that someone who lived with such pain in her off-screen life as Merle Oberon did could gather her composure to create work of such power, beauty, and resonance. Something about Merle's struggle also reached out to me as a young gay kid still living in the closet. Here was a woman who was living in a closet of her own, yet she achieved her dreams, which I found so aspirational. But I was aware even then at that young age that mine was a minority opinion. She commanded neither the respect of cinephiles nor of my fellow Asian Americans who regarded her with such shame. But I always had so much compassion for Merle Oberon, even when others did not. So I vowed one day to write a biography of her if I ever became a professional writer. Which I did, unfortunately for everyone, and that is to say that my book is one that I've been writing in my head for many, many years, even if I started working on it in earnest in late 2021 when I first wrote this proposal. But I faced significant roadblocks as I began my work. I realized I would have to be writing against a torrent of misinformation about Merle. especially the kind that has really burrowed itself into the public consciousness quite stubbornly. And much of that, I'm afraid, does have to do with the sole pre-existing biography of Merle Oberon prior to mine, which was 1983's Princess Merle, co-authored by Charles Hyam, whom you see on the screen right there, and Roy Mosley. Before, I want to preface what I'm about to say by, acknowledging that I am indebted to that book in many respects, because it really was the first to debunk the myth of Merle's Tasmanian provenance and instead reveal that she had indeed been born as a mixed-race girl into poverty in India. That said, those of you who are familiar with Hollywood scholarship might know the name Charles Hyam. He had quite a reputation for sometimes making outlandish claims in his books, especially on men like Errol Flynn and Howard Hughes. Yet any such claims he made in his book on Merle became accepted wisdom despite their relatively thin sourcing. This was also a time long before endnotes and certain citation practices were de rigueur in publishing as they are today. Furthermore, the existence of fictional spins on Merle's life in subsequent years, like her former nephew by marriage, Michael Korda's Queenie, a novel, further muddied the waters. That put me in a very trying position as her biographer. I essentially had to start from square one in my research and reporting. It was also my job to, of course, separate fact from fiction, and to make sure each of Hyam and Mosley's more questionable assertions stood up to my own journalistic scrutiny. And if they did not, I would have to jettison them from my telling. I also had to account for certain revelations that emerged after the 1983 publication of Princess Merle. The most crucial concerned the identity of Merle's mother. What became public knowledge in 2002, thanks to the Australian filmmaker Marie Villavsky's documentary The Trouble with Merle, was that her biological mother was in reality the girl Merle believed to be her half-sister, a woman named Constance, whom you see right there. Constance had given birth to Merle when she was only 14 years old. Wow. Merle was conceived of rape. According to her birth certificate, Merle's father was Constance's stepfather. To divert scandal, Merle's dark-skinned Sinhalese grandmother, Constance's mother, Charlotte, raised Merle as her own daughter. In terms of my reporting process, I thus felt it imperative to track down Merle's surviving family members from India. And after really pounding the pavement, blood, sweat, tears, the works, lots of cold emails to strangers or random people, stonewalled, I finally found them, and I got them to speak to me on the record. And they supplied me with her birth certificate, which you can see here, along with her baptismal certificate, along with other pertinent records. Her family also reframed my understanding of Merle's own conception of her identity. Despite being of Sri Lankan extraction, Merle was subsumed into the broader racial category of the Anglo-Indian within the context of British India. Merle, or Queenie as she was then known, was very much subject to the social penalties that came with such identification. As a member of this mixed-race Anglo-Indian community, she was ostracized often by both the white folks and South Asians, mocked for her low-class status and her uncouth accent. One white British friend of hers from her Kolkata days would compare her manner of speech to that of Eliza Doolittle, pre-Leslie Howard, Rex Harrison, Keep in mind, she'd also been raised solely by a dark-skinned brown mother. Her white father was absent from the picture in her childhood. So a sentiment that I've encountered today since the publication of my book a few months ago is many armchair, self-proclaimed old Hollywood experts on Wikipedia, Reddit, what have you, they like to believe that she identified as British, but my research and reporting revealed a more complicated truth. Merle's family also helped me humanize Merle's biological mother, Constance. You can see her in another photo from that same sitting from earlier. Merle and Constance's family does not believe Merle ever learned the real identity of her mother. In my research and reporting, I found no persuasive evidence to contradict that belief. Even among her own family in India, Constance maintained this charade, saying that her half-sister was a Hollywood actress. Her family also remembers letters and occasional slips of money arriving from Merle in Hollywood for Constance in India. It was only after the death of both women that the family themselves learned the truth through discovering Merle's birth certificate, though they withheld this information from her previous biographers back in 1983. In terms of process, I supplemented these family interviews with my dutiful trawl through the archives. I pored over old press materials as well as Merle's highly curated, only somewhat revealing personal papers and correspondences, and those of others whose paths she crossed, mostly at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy. I also inspected her travel records, such as passenger manifests, to understand her movements at any given moment. And finally, I obtained what was known as her A file, or alien file, from NARA, or the National Archives and Records Administration. An A file, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a compilation of an individual's immigration and citizenship records if they have not yet been naturalized. You can see a snapshot from Merle's right there. This is a re-entry permit, which was required of her whenever she was coming back to the country after being abroad. And inspecting these documents really complicated my understanding of what Merle was up against in her climb up this Hollywood hill. Historically, people who've been sympathetic to Merle's plight have often pointed to the Hays Code as justification for her passing. The Hays Code, for those of you who do not know, was a set of censorious mandates that began to choke American studio filmmaking starting in 1934. Among its stipulations was a clause barring the depiction of miscegenation or interracial romance, as defined in the text as being between black and white races. Yet the Hays Code had such a chilling effect that this also kneecapped opportunities for non-black performers of color, like, for example, Merle's contemporary Anna May Wong and her attempts to star in The Good Earth, which eventually went to, of course, Louise Reiner. But a layer that was missing from these previous renderings of Merle's story was a larger set of political agitation surrounding her in America. The Immigration Act of 1917 barred immigration from what was then known as India, while a 1923 Supreme Court ruling also declared South Asians ineligible from obtaining American citizenship on the basis of their race. These laws were the result of a long-simmering animus towards South Asians that had infected the American mind since the early 20th century. As such, Merle could have faced a fate far worse than the end of a glamorous Hollywood career had the truth come out. And indeed, what my research and reporting surfaced is that upon her arrival in Hollywood in late 1934, it was routine for newspapers and magazines to print rumors of her mother being a quote-unquote Hindu, as you can see there, which was back then shorthand in the American vernacular for anyone of South Asian descent, regardless of religious creed. So when you understand how the American attitudes towards South Asians enshrined in federal law worked in tandem with the Hays Code to limit her mobility, you get why passing felt like the only option for her to have a better life. The marvel of Merle's career to me was her ability to build a life on such shaky scaffolding. She immigrated to London in 1929 by pretending to be the wife of an English jockey. She was quite resourceful. After slogging her way throughout service work and parts of little consequence on screen, she finally got her proverbial big break as a contract player with the then fledgling production company London Films in 1932, under the charge of Alexander Korda, the man who would become later on the first of her 4 husbands. And there are many more romances that you can read about in my book, of course, that she had. And it was his team who foisted this fictitious studio biography with that Tasmania line upon her. She became a star in British cinema in short order, particularly after a memorable performance as Anne Boleyn in The Private Life of Henry VIII. But Merle very much established her reputation in those early days for playing the quote-unquote exotic for London films, often women of French, Spanish, even Japanese heritage, and that costume, she felt, really began to hinder her artistic growth. Luckily for her, Hollywood came calling, and she migrated there in 1934 despite the danger inherent in going to America. Sam Goldwyn of United Artists took her under his wing, and he wiped the grease paint off of her, pasteurized her image so that she could embody the quintessential English rose. The Dark Angel, in which she played an English girl during World War I, sealed her stardom, and it was capped, of course, with that historic Oscar nomination. Unfortunately, the promise that such recognition suggested did not quite bear out in the years that followed. Those next few years brought with them both professional and personal setbacks, some of which you can read about in my book. And her career lost momentum shortly thereafter. And Goldwyn's final attempt to solidify her box office power with Wuthering Heights in 1939 proved to be a grave financial miscalculation. She and Goldwyn parted ways shortly thereafter. The fallacy that I sought to challenge as I wrote my book was this misguided notion that I've often encountered that because Merle Oberon was able to pass as white because of her relatively light complexion, she just skated through life with nary worry. But what I found is that she was rarely able to enjoy the privilege of feeling safe and secure. During the studio era, for example, she was beholden to punishing tactics like undergoing forced skin bleaching. Her skin tone also became a liability as the industry was changing. She struggled to maintain her stardom into the Technicolor era, as my research surfaced that she was dropped from the Garden of Allah, which was to be her first film in color, due to her insufficient appearance in color tests. The role went instead to Marlene Dietrich, who once snidely called Merle That Singapore Streetwalker, which tells you a bit about the attitudes surrounding her. Merle's immigration status also haunted her. She had occasional brushes with immigration authorities at Ellis Island, such as when she failed to obtain a re-entry permit on a trip back from Canada in 1941. The laws preventing South Asian immigrants from settling in this country and obtaining citizenship were reversed in 1946 with the Loose Seller Act. 10 years later, the Hays Code also excised its clause on miscegenation. But one of the great tragedies of Merle Oberon's story is that she still lived in secrecy for the remainder of her life. She had to forgo her intention to become an American citizen, even after she could have ostensibly done so. This was because she was fearful of what would happen when that process was inevitably publicized. Think about it. She had built her trust with the public on a certain reputational pretense that she was a Tasmanian-born European actress. Revealing the truth would have constituted a breach of that implicit, unspoken contract she had with her audience. She was, as her friend Louis Estevez said, trapped in a lie she did not create. But I find it a real shame that Merle's career petered out in the 1940s, because that decade is when she did some of her finest and, frankly, most underseen work. And when you had, the chance to study it, as I had the privilege of doing while writing this book, you really understand that the dramatic test that Goldwyn subjected her to in the 1930s really forced her to become a more technically proficient actress. She lacked formal training in the way that other actresses of her era had. One of the pleasures of writing this book for me involved discovering some of these sunken treasures in her filmography. And I would say Dark Waters is among the most notable of those hidden gems. Merle made it in a time when her marriage to her first husband, Alex Korda, was on skids, while she was having an affair with the man who would become her second husband, the cinematographer Lucien Ballard. The film was not supposed to be a success. It was based on a magazine serial, and Alex Korda, who was trying to save his marriage to Merle, knew she wanted to do this project very badly, so he begged Andre de Toth to direct it as a favor. De Toth took a look at the script and said, as you see right there, that it was, excuse my language, the biggest piece of shit I had ever read, per a posthumously published interview with Sensitive Cinema. But the film came together despite those challenges. It was well received by critics and also marked Merle's first commercial success in quite some time. And as you spend time with this film tonight, I want you to pay attention to Merle's performance. Think about the distinct flavor and feeling only she could have brought to this role given her life experience. That's why it feels like such a rich text for a biographer like myself to mine, knowing all we know now about Merle. She plays a woman who improbably survives a harrowing tragedy and is soon thrown into a set of circumstances that make her question who she is and struggle to maintain her sense of self. And that might sound familiar. Merle was very much like the woman she plays in this film. She knew intensely and intimately what it was like to live on edge, move in stealth, and find a way to survive despite said struggles. The role was at one point given to Susan Hayward, but I can think of few actresses, with respect to Susan Hayward, of course, of this era who would have imbued this role with the same psychological texture that Merle did. My impetus for writing this book ultimately emerged from my high regard for Merle as an actress and my desire for others to see her the way that I did, as an artist first and foremost, not just a tragedy or a figure of great shame.